The military's job is to dominate any foe and annihilate any threat to America anywhere, anytime.
At 5:17 a.m., Eastern Caribbean Sea, the USS Roosevelt moved steadily through international waters just 12 nautical miles off the Venezuelan coastline. On the bridge of the Aegis-equipped destroyer, assigned to the U.S. Fourth Fleet and responsible for patrolling the southern maritime approaches, the routine calm broke without warning. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar display burst alive with high-speed returns sweeping in from the northeast. Dozens of fast, deliberate tracks lit the screen at once, sharp against the pre-dawn gloom. The alert tone cut through the compartment. The watch team snapped from a regular patrol posture into a threat identification scramble. The tactical action officer demanded IFF verification and called the commanding officer to the bridge. The Roosevelt was on a dual mission, monitoring cartel shipping lanes that the Trump administration had reclassified as an active battleground, while also holding a protective buffer for the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group operating farther west. Follow Military Power for clear, grounded coverage of real-world military flashpoints. Subscribe so you stay ahead of whatever comes. Because this wasn't just another patrol in Trump's Caribbean buildup. This was the morning Russia decided to test the U.S. Navy on America's side of the map. The scene that unfolded near Venezuela that morning didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why Russian warships were barreling toward the USS Roosevelt in the pre-dawn dark, you have to look at the wider geopolitical shift taking shape across the Caribbean. What had once been a quiet maritime corridor had, by early 2025, become a zone of open confrontation shaped by cartel violence, collapsing Venezuelan security, and the return of great power signaling on America's doorstep. The first layer of that shift began with Washington. Under the Trump administration's renewed security doctrine, cartel networks were no longer treated as distant criminal threats, but as armed transnational groups, operating with the scale and discipline of hostile paramilitary forces. According to reporting from Time, this change in classification came with a new mandate. Treat cartel vessels the same way the U.S. treats terrorist transport craft. That meant Navy destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, and Air Force ISR assets were now authorized to intercept and, when justified, strike suspicious fast boats leaving Venezuelan shores. Several confrontations had already turned kinetic, sparking debate, but also sending a clear message that the United States intended to break the trafficking pipelines running through the southern Caribbean. With cartel activity spiking and Venezuelan waters becoming a launch pad for multi-ton shipments, the Pentagon reinforced the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group, according to report, had been deployed southward under the operational umbrella of U.S. Southern Command and the Fourth Fleet, the first time America's most advanced carrier operated so close to Latin America in decades. For months, the Ford's Air Wing had been running maritime patrols, tracking smuggling corridors, and supporting joint interdiction missions. The presence of a 100,000-ton carrier wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a floating command center, anchoring a regional crackdown that Washington believed was long overdue. That's when Russia stepped in. This wasn't the first time Moscow had sent warships into the Caribbean, and anyone familiar with recent history knew what was coming. In 2019, the frigate Admiral Gorshkov visited Cuba after conducting what Russian state media described as long-range missile readiness drills in the Atlantic, a deployment that caught the world's attention because it showcased Russia's then-new Caliber and Onyx missile capabilities at extended ranges. 5 years later, in 2024, Moscow repeated the play. According to World Politics Review and AP News, another Gorshkov-led group crossed the Atlantic, stopping in Havana after simulating long-range strike profiles, including the use of the hypersonic Zircon missile. These deployments weren't accidents, they were demonstrations, reminders that Russia could project into the Western Hemisphere just as NATO vessels navigated near the Barents Sea or the Baltic. Viewed through that lens, the approach of two Gorshkov-class frigates toward Venezuela in 2025 wasn't surprising. It was deliberate. It was messaging. And it was timed precisely at the moment the U.S. was intensifying naval operations near a Moscow-aligned government in Caracas. Russia wasn't simply showing support for Venezuela, it was showing the United States that America's near abroad could be made just as uncomfortable as Russia's.
We reaffirm our firm support for the Venezuelan leadership in protecting its national sovereignty. In the context of the current situation, we are in close ongoing contact with our Venezuelan friends.
This is where the USS Roosevelt comes in. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, outfitted with the Aegis combat system, Roosevelt had been assigned by the 4th Fleet as a forward tripwire, operating several dozen nautical miles ahead of the Ford Strike Group. These destroyers frequently serve as early contact platforms, fast, heavily equipped, and ideal for intercepting or monitoring foreign warships without exposing the carrier itself. In this mission, the Roosevelt functioned as both a scout and a shield. Its job was to hold the line between the Russian formation and the Ford, ensure no vessel could slip into the smuggling corridor undetected, and prevent any attempt, however remote, at Russian escort operations for Venezuelan tankers under U.S. sanctions pressure. It was a narrow, dangerous assignment. Roosevelt had to maintain a stable posture close enough to deter aggression, but not so close that Moscow could accuse the U.S. of impeding freedom of navigation. The margin for error was razor thin. A single maneuver misinterpreted, a single radar lock misread, and the situation could escalate. Seen from that perspective, the morning encounter wasn't just a matter of ships passing each other. It was a test of political resolve, a duel of presence. Russia projected power by sailing advanced frigates into contested waters. America responded by stationing a frontline destroyer directly in their path. Neither side needed to fire a missile. The message was delivered through positioning alone. If you were standing on the Roosevelt's bridge that morning, would you have held your course to signal resolve, or altered it to avoid a diplomatic crisis? From the moment the first radar returns hit the USS Roosevelt's screens, the task was no longer about monitoring suspicious traffic. It was about identifying a potential state adversary in real time. The Roosevelt's Combat Information Center began stitching together every sensor feed it had access to. Surface search radar swept the horizon. ESM receivers hunted for emissions. And, almost immediately, off-board intelligence streams from a P-8A, Poseidon, and satellite data filled in what the destroyer's own mast-mounted systems could not see. What emerged was the outline of a formation America knew well. The contacts measured between 4,500 and 5,400 tons, matching the displacement range documented in open sources for the Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates, Russia's most modern surface combatants under Project 22,350. Their angular superstructure, radar-deflecting lines, and vertical block mast were consistent with the class's signature profile. For the watch team aboard the Roosevelt, this wasn't guesswork. The P-8A's high-resolution imaging and satellite snapshots confirmed it. At least 2 Gorshkovs were closing in. In other words, they weren't just sailing, they were projecting. But what drew equal attention was the third contact trailing the 2 frigates. Smaller, slower, and maintaining a loose orbit a few nautical miles behind, it did not fit the signature of a warship. It could have been an intelligence collection platform, a tender, or even a tug, similar to the support vessels Russia used during previous deployments. Reports from Arma International and posts shared by Russian naval observers noted that when Moscow had sent the Yasin M-class submarine Kazan to Cuba the previous year, it also deployed auxiliary craft to act as communications relays and logistics nodes. The pattern was familiar enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the more elusive indicators. Roosevelt's towed array sonar picked up faint, intermittent returns, deep, slow-moving, and far from the surface group, but traveling in a parallel corridor. No one in the sonar shack called it a submarine, but no one dismissed the possibility either. The depth readings and movement profile were consistent with a submerged escort shadowing from distance. Whether it was a real submarine or just ocean layering playing tricks, the effect on the crew was the same. They operated as though a surface group and a silent hunter were both watching them. And yet, for all of Russia's capabilities, the Roosevelt was not blind. This is where American advantage becomes decisive, not in missiles, but in vision. The destroyer's tactical picture was reinforced by an ISR lattice that few navies in the world can replicate. The P-8A Poseidon provided maritime domain awareness across hundreds of miles. A high-altitude MQ-4C Triton orbits were feeding real-time imagery. MQ-9 reconnaissance tracks from joint tasking added persistent overwatch. Satellite passes updated surface positions with precision. Coastal stations linked through the 4th Fleet augmented the picture further. All of it streamed into the CIC, where Roosevelt's team fused the data into a single, coherent map. This is the unseen side of naval encounters, the side where information wins the first round long before anyone moves a rudder. The Gorshkovs may have carried advanced weapons, but the U.S. Navy held the advantage in layered sensing, a network so broad that the Russian ships, despite their stealth features, were never truly hidden. Naval strategy has a simple truth: the ship that sees first and understands the battle space first holds the initiative. And that's what brought tension to a boil. The Russian formation maintained speed on a course that would cross directly in front of the Roosevelt. On a civilian chart, it might have looked like a routine intercept. In military navigation, it was a deliberate signal. If the Americans did nothing, the Gorshkovs would close within a handful of nautical miles. Well past the threshold, most modern navies consider safe. If either side adjusted course too late or too abruptly, even a small miscalculation could create an international incident. Inside the CIC, the Russian icons on the tactical display crept steadily inward, edging past the 10 nautical mile ring, the psychological boundary where watch teams stop thinking about possibilities and start preparing for contingencies. Every helm correction, every speed change, every alteration of bearing at this stage would be scrutinized by Washington and Moscow alike. The bridge team understood what that trajectory implied. What came next would determine whether this remained a tense standoff or the first real naval confrontation of the new Caribbean Shadow War. The moment the Roosevelt confirmed that 2 Russian Gorshkov-class frigates were closing fast, the commanding officer requested immediate guidance. 4th Fleet's response arrived with the clarity of a legal brief. Observe, document, stay at maximum readiness, and do not fire unless directly threatened. It was the classic high-tension, low-trigger posture often cited in naval doctrine. The kind of restraint Washington needed while Trump's strategy against cartel networks demanded visible strength, but zero accidental clashes with Moscow. The Roosevelt had to look firm without giving Russia any propaganda victory. The destroyer held its position just outside Venezuela's 12 nautical mile boundary, a line that Caracas loudly condemned, but that international law, as noted in past reporting from outlets like The Guardian, placed squarely in U.S. rights. Its presence sent a controlled, deliberate message. America would patrol the Caribbean as close as necessary, and it would do so by the book. Just as the Russians drew nearer, a new complication appeared. A small, fast-moving boat shot out from the Venezuelan coast with no AIS signal and a radar signature consistent with low-profile smuggling craft. It headed straight toward the Roosevelt, its speed rising, its intentions unreadable. Venezuela and cartel groups often use these fast boats for patrols, escorts, and coastal smuggling lanes. Under Trump's directives treating cartel boats as armed threats, even a single unidentified craft carried the potential to ignite a chain reaction.
I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country.
Inside the Roosevelt's CIC, the threat level rose, but the commanding officer held the ROE. The ship would not provoke. It would not fire early. Instead, he widened the defensive bubble in a controlled, unmistakably professional way. AMH-60R Seahawk launched into the sky and took station above the fast boat, turning a one-sided approach into a monitored, layered encounter. From the bridge wings, sailors could see the shift immediately. The intruding vessel was now under the eye of sensors that could track heat signatures, identify faces, and shut down engines if necessary. The Roosevelt hardened posture quietly. VBSS teams geared up. The 25mm gun slewed but stayed safe. CIWS tracked the boat's motion without unlocking a single round. Nothing about the ship's stance was careless or timid. It was deliberate, measured control. The fast boat closed to a few hundred yards, then abruptly changed behavior. Instead of continuing its approach, it veered away, matched the Roosevelt's course for a short moment, almost certainly recording, then fell back toward the Russian formation. The maneuver didn't look accidental. It looked like a probe, a chance to see whether the Americans would panic, threaten, or break formation. They didn't. The Roosevelt tracked, responded, and stayed ready, but refused to escalate. In the geopolitical language of the Caribbean, that restraint mattered. Both Moscow and Caracas learned something in that minute-long standoff. The U.S. Navy would not be baited into giving them the incident they wanted. And now is your turn. If that fast boat had turned sharply toward the Roosevelt and charged at full speed, would you have chosen a warning burst, a disabling shot, or complete non-escalation to deny Russia and Venezuela the spark they were waiting for? The fast boat's withdrawal did little to ease tensions aboard the USS Roosevelt, because the real escalation was unfolding on the open sea. One of the Russian Gorshkov-class frigates broke abruptly from its formation and angled directly toward the American destroyer. The maneuver mirrored a familiar pattern documented in years of Russian interactions with NATO vessels in the Baltic and Black Sea. Close-in harassment designed to test discipline and force an opponent into a reactive move. This time, the same playbook had been brought into the Caribbean. On the Roosevelt's bridge, the range numbers tightened rapidly as the frigate closed distance. The watch team monitored bearing changes and relayed updated ranges with measured precision. A minor course adjustment was briefly considered for safety, but navigation data showed that the U.S. ship was maintaining a lawful, steady track in international waters, while the Russian vessel was the one altering course. Within U.S. naval procedure, altering heading at this moment could be interpreted as seeding room. The decision was made to maintain course and speed, while preparing for an emergency maneuver should the Russian frigate push past acceptable thresholds. Below deck, the ship shifted into a posture designed to document rather than provoke. The close-in weapon system tracked the approaching frigate automatically in passive mode. The main gun remained centered, mast-mounted cameras locked onto the Russian bow. Radar and navigation logs captured each second of the encounter. The objective was clear: maintain professional conduct under the rules of the sea, while providing Washington with irrefutable data on the approaching vessel's actions. The decisive moment came quickly. The Russian frigate crossed the Roosevelt's bow at roughly 3 nautical miles before closing even tighter, then veering away in a controlled sweep. Its wake hit the destroyer's hull with enough force to send vibrations through the deck and rattle unsecured items. Not enough to cause material damage, but enough to signal intent. In maritime terms, it was an unsafe pass, the kind of maneuver that violates standard seamanship and is often highlighted in diplomatic protests. Inside the Combat Information Center, the entire sequence streamed live through multiple sensors. The data showed a consistent American heading, a Russian course change from the moment of approach, the narrowing distance, and the wake impact. This unbroken record established a clear timeline of responsibility, proof that the Roosevelt had held steady while the Russian frigate executed the close-range maneuver. Analysts familiar with Russian naval behavior would recognize the tactic immediately. The goal was not collision, it was pressure. A premature evasive turn could be framed by Russian state media as a retreat. Any aggressive U.S. reaction could be labeled escalation. The maneuver placed the burden of decision entirely on the U.S. vessel, with the hope that a misstep could create a narrative advantage for Moscow. But the Roosevelt did not provide that opportunity. By adhering strictly to navigation rules and established procedures, the ship placed full accountability for the unsafe pass on the Russian side. The destroyer held its line, maintained its operational mission, and avoided any move that could be interpreted as provocation. When the Russian frigate finally cleared the bow and its wake settled, the moment of danger passed as quickly as it had arrived. The American destroyer did not deviate from its course by even a degree. Watchstanders returned to system checks, updated logs, and prepared for the next phase of the standoff with the same measured discipline that had defined the response. For all the noise and theatrics, the Russian test achieved none of its strategic aims. The U.S. destroyer did not yield space, did not alter posture, and did not allow itself to be drawn into a miscalculation. In the high-pressure calculus of modern naval encounters, it was American discipline, not aggression, that shaped the outcome, and that discipline ensured the line held. The near collision didn't end the confrontation. It simply shifted it into a quieter, more grueling phase. After cutting across the Roosevelt's bow, the two Russian Gorshkov frigates stayed put, circling the American destroyer at a few nautical miles. A naval helicopter lifted off one of their decks and ran wide reconnaissance loops overhead, while Venezuelan coastal radars kept sweeping across the entire sector, pulsing onto both fleets, like a constant reminder that every move was under scrutiny. On the Roosevelt, the surge of adrenaline cooled into disciplined focus. The ship transitioned from crisis reflex to endurance mode. Watch teams rotated. Officers stepped onto the bridge with fresh eyes, while others grabbed a minute of rest before returning to screens glowing with contacts and threat tracks. Nobody slacked off. In a space where one misread could ricochet into a geopolitical incident, even the scrape of a chair felt loud. The crew held firm to the Fourth Fleet's rules of engagement. No provocative turns, no weapon postures, no attempts to fade from radar. Their job was simple but demanding. Hold the line, track everything, and deny Russia any excuse to escalate. Aegis systems, tied into the wider Gerald R. Ford strike group, created a layered map of sea, sky, and potential subsurface signatures. The Russians could circle and posture, but they couldn't force Roosevelt off its mission. After 90 minutes, subtle signs hinted at a shift. The Russian helicopter returned to its deck. Their arcs widened. Even Venezuelan radar sweeps grew less insistent. The tension didn't vanish, but it thinned like a storm losing momentum. Finally, a little more than 2 hours after the close pass, the lead Gorshkov turned north and accelerated. Its partner followed. The smaller third vessel trailed behind. To the west, the earlier fast boat drifted back toward the Venezuelan coast and slipped out of view. From afar, it might look like Russia made its point and departed, but operationally the advantage belonged to the Americans. Roosevelt never altered course, never abandoned station, never yielded space. The Russian presence created drama, but didn't shift U.S. posture by an inch. Inside the CIC, there were no cheers, just logs closed, reports filed, and another watch rotation beginning. Sailors drifted back into their 4-on, 8-off routines, grabbing workouts, books, or a few minutes of quiet. The drama faded, replaced again by the daily rhythm of Americans who stand watch so far from home. On paper, it would sound like a minor incident, an unsafe pass, 2 hours of brinkmanship, no shots fired. But those who lived it knew the truth. Even with modern frigates, helicopter probes, and coordinated radar pressure, Russia still couldn't bend U.S. resolve. The Roosevelt held the line because in the world's oceans, it is still the United States that draws it. In the end, the story of that Caribbean morning wasn't written in missile trails or gunfire, but in steadiness. The USS Roosevelt detected a Russian formation moving fast toward Venezuelan waters, accepted the strict order to observe without engaging, held firm through a dangerously close pass, managed a probing run from a Venezuelan fastboat, and never surrendered a single mile of its patrol line. When the moment of truth arrived, it was the Russian ships that turned away first. The U.S. destroyer stayed exactly where it was meant to be. That is its own kind of victory. No shots fired, no headlines of explosions, just American sea power enforcing the rules, keeping the mission on track, and reminding every observer that professionalism is its own deterrent. Looking ahead, Russia will likely continue sending Gorshkov-class frigates with long-range missiles into the Caribbean, and Venezuela will keep using radars and fast boats to test boundaries. But neither can match what the United States brings to the region. Forward bases, reliable allies, the enduring reach of a carrier strike group like the Gerald R. Ford, and sailors who stand watch month after month to ensure no one crosses that red line. In a world full of noise, American strength sometimes speaks loudest in silence. If you want to follow what happens the next time Russian warships nose around America's backyard, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Military Power so you never miss the next mission. See you next time.